And we're just going to wait one more minute just to give more time for people to come in. I think it's time to get started. So good afternoon and good morning to those of you on the West Coast. My name is Francesca Bregoli. I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. I'm delighted to welcome you to our first public event of the full semester with Rachel Gross. I wish we could welcome you in person in our iconic B. Ullman building on Fifth Avenue, but that is not yet possible this semester. However, staying on Zoom allows us to reach out to many more of you outside of New York. And it's nice to see many friends on this call. Some of you I know very well. And also it's great to see some new faces. So if you'd like to learn more about the activities of the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Center, please email us. I will put the email in the chat box momentarily, and we'll make sure to put you on our mailing list so you can get updates about our upcoming programs. Today's program will feature a presentation by Professor Rachel Gross on her groundbreaking new book, Beyond the Synagogue, Jewish Nostalgia as Religious Practice, that appeared for NYU Press in 2021. And I want to alert you that NYU Press is offering a 30% discount and free shipping on the book. And I'll post the code in the chat box again in a moment. The event, as you can see, is being recorded, and later it's going to be uploaded to the center's YouTube channel. I want to invite you to keep your microphones muted during Professor Gross's talk. We will have plenty of time for questions. If you have a question, you can either write the word question in the chat box if you're able to unmute yourself, and I'll call on you in the order that the questions are received. If you're unable to unmute yourself, please feel free to type out your question in the chat box and we'll read it out loud for you. And now our speaker. Rachel V. Gross is assistant professor and John and Marsha Goldman Chair in American Jewish Studies in the Department of Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University. She is a religious studies scholar who studies 20th and 21st century American Jews. She's the author of many articles on the specifically American articulations of the Jewish religion, and her new book, Beyond the Synagogue, Jewish Nostalgia as Religious Practice, which she will present today, has received an honorable mention for the 2021 Sol Wiener Book Prize given by the American Jewish Historical Society. We're so happy that Rachel could join us today. And without further ado, Professor Gross, the Zoom stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Francesca, and thanks to all of you for coming today on a Friday afternoon or Friday morning. If, like me, you're on the West Coast, I'm really glad to be able to share my work with the CUNY Graduate Center. Can you see my screen, my PowerPoint? Fantastic. So I teach in a Jewish studies department at San Francisco State, and I'm trained in religious studies, which means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But for me, being a religious studies scholar means asking questions about how people make meaning in their lives. And like many other religious studies scholars, I think of one goal of religious studies as making the familiar strange and the strange familiar. So I think of my work as working particularly on the first half of that phrase, making the familiar strange. So I am interested in analyzing everyday activities that we might take for granted. The stories that especially Jews tell about themselves, their families, and their communities through everyday activities, the ways that they ask weighty existential questions like, who am I? Where do I come from? And I think that the ordinariness of these questions, the fact that folks ask them every day, should make them no less remarkable. So I want to begin by looking at one of my favorite ordinary moments from my research on American Jewish nostalgia. Back in the day when we could freely go places, I watched visitors to the museum at Eldridge Street sit down in the pews of the beautifully restored 1887 Eldridge Street Synagogue on the Lower East Side. And they listened to a docent recount the history of the Grand Synagogue built by Eastern European Jewish immigrants. When the docent finished, she led the group out of the sanctuary, and then she paused at the back of the room. Step into the indentations in the floorboards, she instructed the tourists, and soon people had arranged themselves in straight lines. Since I know I'm speaking to some folks in New York, maybe you have gone on this tour, maybe you will go on this tour. So tourists end up in straight lines, and she asked them, why do you think you've ended up in these straight lines as you're standing in the indentations? And slowly the group realizes that they are standing very literally in the footprints of former male congregants. And the indentations in the soft pine floorboards had been made by men shuckling, rocking back and forth in front of their pew as they prayed in the traditional Jewish manner. And over the years, they'd left their mark in the floorboards. And the docent demonstrates the movement and others copy her. A few tourists are usually familiar with the rocking motion from their own synagogue services. Most of them kind of shuffle awkwardly, if enthusiastically. But standing in the footprints, the literal footprints of former congregants, provides an immediate sensory connection to the past, one that engages visitors' whole bodies. And the experience is a highlight for many tourists. One wrote on Yelp, "You literally feel the history at your feet." And the docent's careful orchestration of this moment helps visitors to experience a connection to the past, to past congregants, physically and emotionally. In my book, Beyond the Synagogue, Jewish Nostalgia as Religious Practice, I look at the materials and institutions through which American Jews engage, promote, and teach nostalgia for turn-of-the-century Jewish immigration from Central and Eastern Europe to the United States. And I find that nostalgia, a sentimental longing for Jewish communal origins that can't be fulfilled, is both an emotion and a practice. And as a feeling and a practice, I found that nostalgia has become a prominent part of American Jewish religion since the 1970s and into the present day. I look at 4 case studies of Jewish genealogists and their organizations and materials, historic synagogues that are used as museums. This is the Eldridge Street Synagogue again, children's books and dolls, and artisanal delis and other Jewish food sites. This is Saul's Deli in Berkeley, California, near me in Northern California. I find that these materials encourage and spaces encourage American Jews to feel nostalgia for a particular story about Ashkenazi history, and that nostalgia is best understood as part of American Jewish religion. So making this claim about religion requires us to expand our typical understanding of what counts as religious practice and where we look at for religious activities. And what I'm going to do in the rest of my presentation is try to think together about what kind of nostalgia I'm talking about and what we mean by nostalgia and what I mean by religion. I'll trace the historical development of American Jewish nostalgia, the forms that it takes, and the places where I see it. And I'll wrap up by thinking about one of the implications of taking this kind of nostalgia seriously. I think it shows us, against the arguments of some worried Jewish community leaders, that American Judaism, in fact, American Jewish religion, I would say, is not in decline, but is evolving and flourishing. So in looking at the work of genealogists, historic synagogues, children's books, and delis, I'm interested in the ways that material culture is used to induce, teach, or convey nostalgic longing for particular Jewish pasts as a fundamentally significant way of being Jewish. Many of you will be quite familiar with the fact that many Jews in many times and places have used physical goods to create Jewish spaces and Jewish communities. I think that the materials and institutions of nostalgia do more than connect other American Jews to other Jews in the present. I think they provide sacred meaning that places individuals in relation to past, present, and future communities. So I think that religion is best understood as meaningful relationships and the practices, narratives, and emotions that create and support these relationships. So I think it's mostly about sacred relationships. In making this claim, I'm building on the work of religious studies scholar Robert Orsi, who describes religion as networks of relationships among the living, between the living and the dead, and or between humans and the divine, and that each of these types of relationships can be emphasized in different ways at different times. My teacher, religious studies scholar Catherine Lofton, says, whatever else religion might be, it is a way of describing the structures by which we are bound or connected to one another. So I think understanding religion as relationships and structures helps us recognize the ways that families, communities, and memory are central to religious activity. Thinking about individuals' relationships with families, communities, ancestors, and the divine as central to religion helps us think about how individuals who don't necessarily see themselves as religious make meaning, make sacred meaning in their lives, as well as how those who do see themselves as religious also find meaning outside of traditional religious practices, guided by a variety of supposedly secular institutions and materials. And this image is a collage of family photographs from the writer and artist Sheldon Oberman, which I'll return to later. I think American Jews create and engage with nostalgia through materials and institutions that invoke a community that includes both the living and the dead, and that provide meaning in the present by telling stories about the past. And I think these are two important features of religious practice. Nostalgia for Ashkenazi immigration history to the United States builds on traditional forms of Jewish memory and emotion. At the Passover Seder, Jews say that they too should feel as if they had been freed from Egypt. And I think a lot of the nostalgia work that I'm looking at is building on that you too should feel as if you immigrated from Eastern Europe at the turn of the 20th century. But I also think that thinking about nostalgia as an American Jewish religious practice helps us think more broadly about the ways that American Jews make meaning in their lives beyond holiday and traditional ritual practices in their everyday lives, in supposedly secular practices and institutions. So, of course, the tourists at the museum at Eldridge Street didn't just happen to arrive at the historic synagogue and place their feet in the grooves of long ago congregants. American Jews have long seen the Lower East Side as a site of authentic emotional connection to communal history. Although Jewish history in the Americas dates back to the earliest years of European colonialism, the majority of American Jews are descendants from Central and Eastern Europeans who immigrated to the United States between 1880 and 1920. Many settled in New York's Lower East Side and other urban immigrant neighborhoods. And in the mid to early 20th century, they began to move their families out of these crowded neighborhoods for more spacious parts of the city and suburbs. But they kept thinking about the neighborhood, and some kept coming back. In the early 20th century, those Jews who left the Lower East Side were replaced by new arrivals until Congress severely limited Eastern European immigration in 1924. And beginning in the 1970s and 80s, as what scholars call a white ethnic revival turned many Americans' attention to their ancestries, American Jews thought about their former urban ethnic neighborhoods with nostalgic longing. As they did so, American Jews reflected together on this history in a number of different ways. In the mid-1970s, inspired by the African-American roots movement of that era, which was named for Alex Haley's book, his 1976 book, Roots, an imaginative history of an African-American family. American Jewish genealogists were really inspired by African Americans and others, but especially African American root searching. And American Jewish genealogists began to organize and educate themselves in the 1970s. They began to write manuals and create Jewish genealogical societies in the 70s. A decade later, in the 1980s, historians and preservationists started paying attention in earnest to the role that historic synagogues might play in Jewish public life. This is the moment when folks start thinking about preserving the Eldridge Street Synagogue. It's going to take a little while to gather the funds, but I think this movement really starts going in the 1980s. In the 1990s, mainstream publishing houses really start publishing an increasing number of children's books depicting stories of Jewish immigration as part of a broader push to publish children's books as part of the broader American story of multiculturalism. And in the 21st century, in more recent years, the Eastern European Jewish culinary revival begins in earnest with the appearance of artisanal delis and other businesses created by Jewish food entrepreneurs. American Jews could connect to this past and other Jewish histories through a variety of older types of Jewish institutions and media, such as passively watching a movie or a live performance of Fiddler on the Roof. I'm gonna move away from that GIF. And I think that the new materials of nostalgia that I'm looking at encourage a more active longing for Eastern European Jewish immigration history than just watching a movie or a play does. Longing activates agency beyond a passive connection. Jewish genealogists actively research their family histories. Visitors at historic synagogues step into the footprints of past congregants, literally and metaphorically. Parents read illustrated children's books aloud and encourage children to play with certain toys. And restaurant patrons literally consume their longing for Eastern European Jewish immigration history. So while some forms of nostalgic popular culture are accessible for audiences of all ages, like the catchy tunes, memorable dances, and iconic images of Fiddler on the Roof, others are very specifically designed for people of certain ages, especially children of certain ages and their parents. And we don't normally think about the institutions that create and distribute children's books and dolls as forms of public history, programs and institutions that teach history to a broad public. But nostalgic children's books help parents to prime children to understand a certain emotional reaction to particular Jewish histories as an American Jewish value. Excuse me. Diane Hess, the executive editor at Scholastic Press, which has published many Jewish children's books, told me most kids don't have any Jewish background now, and they don't have that nostalgia for the immigrant grandparents. And for me, it's like you can't lose that because that's sort of the glue that's been holding the culture together, she told me. Children's books about Jewish history help Jewish children and parents place their family stories within broader communal histories. And I think that the commercial exchange of certain Jewish children's books reconstitutes nostalgic longing and helps pass it from one generation to the next. We also don't normally think about restaurants as sites of public history, but I think that they also are important places that shape emotional reactions to particular histories. The immediacy of eating encourages asking and answering questions about yourself, your identity, your community. And certain Jewish restaurants encourage patrons to relate their own family stories. Elise Lerner, owner of On Rye, a now closed deli in Washington, D.C., told me a lot of people come in and they want to tell us their experiences that they've had with this food growing up. And many restaurateurs and purveyors of Jewish food tell stories of their own family histories and of Jewish communal histories through their food, their decor, and their presentation. I think these are actually really thoughtful, often really thoughtful sites of public history. And like all sites of public history, these restaurants have a particular point of view. For Karen Edelman, the co-owner of Saul's Deli in Berkeley, the principal story told in Saul's Deli is, she told me, that of Ashkenazi Jews from the old world and then New York, and then they keep going west until they hate California. And I love this articulation because it makes Saul's Deli and it makes Berkeley, California, and its patrons, the patrons of Saul's Deli, the apotheosis of Jewish history. Nostalgia places individuals and communities within an emotionally resonant story. And these new forms of public history often involve thinking critically about the past and about the effect of the past on the present. They can challenge who we think of as an authority on Jewish history, identity, and practice. So the Jewish culinary revivalists I study, for instance, are deliberately making American Jewish food fit for the 21st century. They are reimagining classic Ashkenazi dishes in light of concerns about sustainability, reliance on local goods, and the slow food movement, as well as their emotional resonance. So when Karen Edelman and Peter Levitt bought Saul's Deli in Berkeley from its founding owners, it had been a longstanding kind of normal deli for a very long time. And when they bought it, many of the restaurant's ingredients were shipped from New York to Berkeley. Karen and Peter were interested in participating in the Bay Area's food movement. And Peter and Karen began to reshape their menu with local and seasonal ingredients. They thought about their work as honoring Ashkenazi American cuisine by elevating it. But they ran into a pickle problem. You might know, maybe you don't know, that a half sour pickle is properly made from a fresh cucumber and eaten 6 to 20 days after pickling. After about 20 days, you no longer have a half sour pickle. You probably have a full sour pickle on your hands. And Levitt and Edelman wanted to serve pickles made from local cucumbers grown between June and November. But deli customers expect a half sour pickle to be available all year round. So for a little while, customers at Saul's had to endure having half sour pickles alongside their sandwiches only in seasonally appropriate months, along with lessons in agriculture, geography, and Jewish culinary history. As you can imagine, this was a hard lesson for some customers to swallow, so to speak. And I think that the owners of Saul's eventually gave in and now serve half sour pickles year round. I want to suggest that the purveyors of nostalgic American Jewish public history who are deliberately working to create community around particular materials of Jewish public history should be considered a kind of Jewish communal leader or even a kind of religious expert. Jewish genealogists, museum staff members, children's book authors, and restaurateurs create and curate the materials designed to elicit particular emotional and religious reactions to certain Jewish pasts. And they are Jews who have rarely been recognized as leaders or experts, either by scholars or in Jewish communal conversations. And they don't necessarily see themselves as Jewish leaders. Often, in fact, staff members at these kind of organizations deliberately minimize their own work. They want to emphasize their patrons' authority on the subject in order to solicit their patrons' buy-in. If we acknowledge the leadership of these content creators, it'll help us think about the importance of these new types of Jewish communal organizations. Looking at these folks as Jewish communal and religious leaders helps us think about how they are guiding American Jews at least as much as those whose Jewish communal leadership has been recognized throughout the 20th century, such as rabbis and directors of Jewish federations, American Zionist organizations, and certain other Jewish nonprofits. In fact, looking at the practices of nostalgia might help us further break down binaries between religious leaders and lay practitioners. So the authoritative genealogist, for instance, might be either a professional or an amateur genealogist. Genealogists actually use the words professional and amateur in very particular ways that I find very intriguing. In general, if you're a genealogist who researches your own genealogy, you're an amateur genealogist, no matter how much knowledge or expertise you might have. And if you're somebody who researches others' genealogy for pay, you're a professional genealogist. So amateur and professional genealogists generally do the same work with the same tools. And most genealogists, amateur or professional, are not formally trained in historical research, but have learned research skills informally through practice and from other genealogists. And as I spoke to Jewish genealogists throughout the country, I learned that while much of the leadership of non-Jewish genealogy organizations have genealogy certifications, this is generally not the case in Jewish genealogy leadership. Instead, community members confer respect on those doing research deemed legitimate and substantive by others in the community. So authoritative Jewish genealogists are those who uphold communal standards while honoring their family histories by researching and memorializing them through physical and digital records, telling family stories, sometimes saying Kaddish, the Jewish mourner's prayer, among other practices that create material and emotional connections to Jewish familial and communal histories. Now, just because the creators and the curators of American Jewish nostalgia should be considered Jewish religious leaders does not mean that audiences listen to them uncritically. This is a position with which other religious leaders are all too familiar, especially Jewish religious leaders. As at all sites of public history, docents and staff members at historic synagogues, for instance, provide rules of acceptable behaviors to visitors. But as I observed, visitors routinely refuse to observe these guidelines. Jewish visitors approach historic Jewish spaces with a sense of entitlement, and the staff members at these places actually work to encourage that sense of entitlement, even as they're trying to regulate visitors' behavior. So for instance, at the Jewish Museum of Florida, which is housed in two adjacent synagogue buildings, once owned by a single congregation, in the South Beach neighborhood of Miami Beach, the Jewish Museum of Florida encourages visitors and donors' sense of authority over their space through its advertising slogan, which I love. Whether your family history came here 100 years ago or today, this museum is about you and for you. So I love this line because it's not clear who you are, right? Who is the you that they're addressing? Do you have to be Jewish or Floridian or American? And what happens when visitors' ideas of the past differ from staff members' visions? The museum intentionally leaves these questions unasked, allowing visitors to formulate their own answers in that void. As I did my research, as I conducted research at historic synagogues and observed tour after tour at these spaces, I repeatedly observed that visitors focused on the ways that their own family histories related to the site, or even relived their past experiences as visitors there, ignoring and sometimes contradicting and speaking over docents' remarks. So the Jewish Museum of Florida's slogan insists that you, whoever you are, have a stake in the museum's mission, regardless of your personal history and your view of the past. So a shared vision of communal nostalgia, some kind of grand narrative, helps smooth over the differences between visitors and heritage institutions' constructions of the past. Now, Jewish deli owners also, especially those telling stories of Jewish immigration outside of New York, also navigate conflicts with customers. Deli owners outside of New York routinely told me that customers are constantly comparing their restaurants to the customer's ideal of a New York deli, even if the customers haven't been to an actual New York deli in years, maybe if ever, and even if restaurateurs are repeatedly insisting that they don't want to emulate a New York deli. So at Saul's Deli, Karen and Peter explained to customers, recreating the New York deli is not our charge. Food, authenticity, flavor, sustainability, survival, and being true to the values of our culinary roots are our first priority. So like other Jewish culinary revivalists, Peter and Karen are attempting to shift customers' framework of authenticity, what they recognize as authentic Jewish food, from emulation of an ideal New York to new stories about Jewish food, history, and memory. Now, nostalgia is a norm, and as such, nostalgia always encourages the most simplistic and streamlined versions of any story. The nostalgic longing of American Jews for stories of Eastern European immigration at the turn of the century, and for the Eastern European past behind that, deliberately centers Ashkenazi experiences and marginalizes other Jewish stories. American Jewish genealogists might find that they have diverse backgrounds, but I found that many of them are in fact drawn to family stories of Eastern European immigrants that fit this larger narrative. By necessity, the materials and practices of this nostalgia exclude certain people and certain stories. And really interestingly to me, I'm interested in the way other stories are actually folded into it. This Ashkenazi nostalgia is so powerful that it's inescapable, even if you yourself are not an Ashkenazi Jew. For instance, the menu at Saul's Deli, like other delis, offers a number of dishes from Middle Eastern cuisine, inspired by Sephardi and Mizrahi Jewish pasts. So serving selective Middle Eastern dishes actually allows Saul's to serve more vegan and vegetarian entrees, which is important for a restaurant in Berkeley, but can be challenging for a Jewish deli, whose cuisine is mostly about meat. Peter and Karen told me broadening that story a little bit is a sidestep that's inclusive of both more Jewish pasts and more customers, and allows Saul's to continue to tell the story of Jewish cultures and Jewish food beyond the monolithic narrative of Ashkenazi American food. But at the same time, this inclusion folds non-Ashkenazi Jewish histories into the narrative of Ashkenazi nostalgia. The side dish might be Mizrahi, might be Middle Eastern, but the larger platter and the deli itself remains focused on Central and Eastern European heritage. As these purveyors of American Jewish nostalgia tell stories of Jewish immigration, they often present turn-of-the-century Eastern European Jews as model immigrants. And as this specific moment in Jewish history becomes a generic story of American immigration, they expand the congregation of their participants in their nostalgic narratives to include even non-Jews. And this inclusion is often a performance of multiculturalism. It suggests the view that the United States has become a hodgepodge of ethnicities, all of which might be celebrated by all Americans. Just as you don't have to be of Irish Catholic descent to participate in St. Patrick's Day celebrations in the United States, you of course don't have to be Jewish to engage in American Jewish nostalgia and to participate in the community created by its materials and practices. But I think that while St. Patrick's Day has been largely has been largely shorn of its religiosity, the materials of American Jewish nostalgia can simultaneously welcome non-Jewish participants in Eastern European Jewish nostalgia and still retain its specific Jewish religious qualities. Nostalgic children's books feature in the catalog of PJ Library, which is a program that distributes free children's books and music with Jewish content to Jewish and interfaith families. I happen to think that PJ Library is one of the most important and influential organizations in American Judaism at all. I think last time I checked, I'm still the only scholar to have published specifically on PJ Library. I think everybody should be talking about it. The organization emphasizes that children's books are not just for children, but are meant to be read aloud by older family members who, like the children, should be receptive to their messages about Jewish history and values. PJ Library staff members are very, very reluctant. They do not want to call their program a religious one. For a number of very strategic reasons, but they do explicitly aim to change families' values and practices, including remembering certain aspects of Jewish history, such as turn-of-the-century immigration history. And anecdotal and their own quantitative evidence very convincingly suggests to me that they have that they are having an absolutely significant influence on Jewish and interfaith families in North America. One book, one among many books that they distribute that tells the story of Eastern European Jewish immigrants is Sheldon Oberman's The Always Prayer Shawl. I showed his collage, or his family collage, earlier. The Always Prayer Shawl tells the story of a boy's immigration from Eastern Europe to North America. Oberman himself was Canadian, but he made the story generically American to appeal to readers in the United States. My Canadian friends assure me this is a very Canadian thing to do. The boy brings with him his grandfather's prayer shawl, which he eventually passes on to his own grandson. The Always Prayer Shawl tells this particular story of Jewish immigration. And in fact, it comes out of Oberman's experience inheriting his grandfather's prayer shawl and giving a prayer shawl to his son. But Oberman encouraged audiences of all backgrounds to find themselves in this story of heirlooms and intergenerational connections. He, in fact, frequently wore his grandfather's prayer shawl while reading the Always Prayer Shawl aloud to audiences, expanding the religious use of the garment to book read-alouds. When a non-Jewish author complimented Oberman at a reading, saying, "I wish I could tell stories like you," he responded by taking the prayer shawl from his own shoulders and placing it on her shoulders and saying, "Yes, you can do it." And the prayer shawl and Oberman's story really comfortably incorporate Jews and non-Jews into the emotions and the network of relationships of North American Jewish nostalgia. Now, I want to wrap up by thinking about how nostalgic activities such as touring the museum at Eldridge Street or buying a pastrami sandwich at a deli, thinking about these things as religious practices helps us respond to the claims of Jewish leaders and Jewish sociologists who see Jewish religion on the decline in the United States. Since the mid-20th century, American Jewish community leaders have worried very loudly that American Jews' religiosity is waning. Sometimes they often describe as assimilation into mainstream American culture. This is Look magazine's famous 1964 cover story about the vanishing American Jew. And I think what they mean particularly is the vanishing religious American Jew. In recent decades, Jewish community leaders have worried about the effects of intermarriage in what has been termed a marriage crisis or a continuity crisis. Now, congregational rabbis tend to have a really prescriptive definition of religion. They're focused on synagogue attendance and the performance of holiday and life cycle celebrations. And quantitative sociologists who have guided Jewish communal conversations are looking for activities that can be measured, such as attending synagogues, keeping kosher, sending children to Jewish religious schools. The most recent national study of American Jews, Pew Research Center's Jewish Americans in 2020, which came out in May, comes out of this legacy. Like the 2013 Pew study of American Jews, this study of Jews in 2020 divides Jews into Jews by religion and Jews of no religion. Jews by religion are those who say their current religion is Jewish. And according to Pew, 27% of American Jewish adults do not identify their religion as Jewish, but consider themselves Jewish ethnically, culturally, or by family background. But I think that American Jews, like other Americans, are just not very good at naming religion in their lives. The division between Jews by religion and Jews of no religion, and related worries about the decline of American Jewish religion, incorrectly identify the ways that Jews think about and practice Judaism in the United States. When Jewish community leaders and sociologists distinguish between Jewish culture and Jewish religion, many of the ways that American Jews create meaning in their lives as individuals, families, and communities are flattened or even erased. And I think that many fears about assimilation resist the idea that Judaism, like all human endeavors, has and will always change over time. These fears rely on the idea of a static Judaism and a static American culture, seeing the two as mutually exclusive rather than responsive to each other. The activities of American Jewish nostalgia are typically thought of as leisure activities, and for participants, they can take up as much time and money as one allows. You can do a quick search of family history on Ancestry.com in your spare time, or you can pursue Jewish genealogy as a serious researcher over many decades, contributing to local, national, and international Jewish genealogical forums, databases, and organizations. The fact that nostalgia might recede into the background of an American Jew's life, only to reappear repeatedly in different contexts, points to its role in structuring individual experiences into broader narratives of meaning, which is, I think, the work that religion does. So, recognizing the dynamic practices, desires, pleasures, and play of American Jewish nostalgia as religious ones points us to the variety of ways that Americans find constitutive meaning in their lives beyond traditional denominational structures, in institutions and through practices that have generally been considered secular. Redefining American Jewish religion expands where we see Americans finding meaning and which institutions we recognize as most powerful in their lives. Americans are shaped by norms and values that are articulated not only by their synagogues, their churches, their mosques and temples, but also by restaurants, publishing companies, toy manufacturers, gift shops, museums, and philanthropic organizations, which teach them not only how to behave, but also how to feel. And thank you. I welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for such a wonderful presentation of your research. There's a lot of food for thought. And while we're waiting for questions, let me just start with a question of my own. I know you've been presenting your work in different venues, and I'm very curious to hear about the kind of feedback you've received, and if you've received any pushback from members of Jewish congregations, from religious leaders, traditional religious leaders of these congregations.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Absolutely, I get a lot of pushback. Some people are really committed to the idea that Judaism is declining, and that American Jews are getting less religious. I think there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. I also think, look, if you don't like the way I'm defining religion, that's fine. I think my job as a religious studies scholar is, one, to participate in scholarly conversations including with folks who use religion in a really particular way. But in terms of my talks with Jews who are not scholars, I think it's fine if I tell folks that it's fine. You don't have to buy my argument about religion. But what I'd like to do in my work with Jewish communities is say, okay, let's look at the ways that important work is being done outside of things we recognize as traditional religious. You don't have to call it religious, but does this help you think about where you find sacred community, where you find sacred meaning in your lives? And I think folks are really receptive to that. I'm a little bit surprised as I wrote a book about that's like very literally called Beyond the Synagogue. A lot of synagogue leaders, rabbis, and other congregational leaders are like, great, tell us how we can do this. Like, literally, the point is that people are doing this work outside of synagogues, but synagogues have a very expansive vision in the United States. I'll say just one more thing that I've also gotten pushback, and I write about this in my conclusion, that I got pushback from the folks I was studying as well, right? And that research can be, those of you who study living people will know that's pretty complicated. That on the one hand, I want to be respectful of the way that people see themselves, and also as a religious studies scholar, I see myself offering a framework of meaning and interpretation of their work that they may or might not find of value. When I studied genealogists in particular, I think my work has been received in different ways by different folks. When I present my work to Jewish genealogists, I've found that, these folks are going to have pushback both to the idea that their work is religious and the label of nostalgia. Especially because while I think nostalgia does really important work, a lot of people think about nostalgia as kind of, they want to dismiss nostalgia as unimportant. And my work is suggesting that it is actually important in a useful word. I found that a lot of, actually, while my work is looking at folks of all genders, I found that the response to my work has been particularly gendered. So when I present my work to Jewish genealogists, a lot of men, in particular male leaders of Jewish genealogy organizations, want their work to be taken seriously, as researchers of Jewish history, and they really push back against my framework. I respect that. That's fine. They don't have to like it. But a lot of women have really said, look, you're naming something we couldn't quite put our finger on, that the emotional work that you're pointing out, even as we do really careful research, you're pointing out the importance of the emotional work, that it's placing us in an emotional framework that connects us to our families, to our communal histories. So a variety of responses. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's a lot to learn from these responses. We have a question from Eric Alterman, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hi. Oh. Yeah, I'm unmuted, no?
You are, yeah.
Okay. Okay, first of all, I just want to mention, you mentioned the museum in South Beach, and I just want to point out that there's a window in that museum dedicated to Meyer Lansky.
Absolutely,
so
yeah.
That's funny. So listen, I don't dispute what you're saying, but I do, this is really not your problem, but I don't see that it points to anything sustainable across future generations. I mean, I myself, I live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. This is funny. The only Jewish deli in my neighborhood is closed, and it only opens up when they film Mrs. Maisel in it. So it's a good metaphor there. I participate in this with my daughter, but I don't expect my daughter to participate in this with her future children. I think you're pointing to something that is a real problem, that with the distancing from Israel and the distance from the Holocaust, that the content of American Judaism is not there nobody really can define it, what it is. And so we're reaching for these things, nostalgia being the most prominent one. And you've pointed to the way nostalgia manifests itself. But I would say in another 2 generations, you have about 20% of the people feeling the way that you describe as feel that way. People who are my age, I'm 60. So I'm wondering if people have spoken to you about that and if you address that.
Absolutely. Thanks for that comment and question. I do get a lot of folks saying, look, this is not sustainable. To which I think I have a couple of responses. I think that on the one hand, as you say, it's not my problem, but on the other hand, look, all iterations of Jewish community come from a particular moment. That I think the ways that you're identifying about relating to the Holocaust and relating to Israel come from particular historical moments. And what you might be naming is that that the ways that that American Jewish communities constituted themselves in earlier decades, right? That those are very specific historical moments about thinking about the American Jewish community centered around the Holocaust memory and centered around Israel. And that you're right that what I'm seeing is that many American Jews are saying, look, the Holocaust memory is too depressing, and Israel focusing on Israeli politics and support for the state of Israel is too divisive. And that this is, I am absolutely presenting this is a third way that American Jews are creating community and telling historical narratives about themselves. Do I expect it to last? It's actually lasted a lot longer than folks have expected. When I started, this was my dissertation, and took me a long time to get it into a book. So I've been researching this since about 2006 or so. And at that point, people were like, oh yeah, these hipster delis are just a fad. They might be, but like, here we are in 2021 and they're still here. So maybe these things have a longer staying power than we think they do. On the other hand, I don't think that's a problem. I think what the takeaway that I want folks to see from my work is that the narratives that we tell, the historical narratives that American Jews tell about themselves do change over time. That's a thing that's always happened. And that's not a scary thing, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you for that question.
We do have more time for questions. Oh, I see Stephen Silvern.
Hi there. Hi, Rachel. Nice to see you and hear you, and I enjoyed your talk. I guess I don't have an issue with thinking about nostalgia and the importance of it and meaning making. I guess I'm wondering your thoughts about the notion of tradition, which is embedded in that, but may also be its own sort of way of making meaning. And I'm thinking about I'm thinking about food, and I'm thinking about Jewish food movement and Jewish farming in particular as a way of returning, sort of recreating tradition in the contemporary moment. And I'm thinking about things like how do we incorporate the traditional, agrarian ideas from Torah and the Bible, like the Shemitah, like this is a Shemitah year. So it's not the same as your examples of nostalgia, but it seems to me it's Jewishness in a different vein. So I don't have a question maybe, but just the comment.
Yeah, thank you. I think the Jewish farming movement is super related. I mean, it's very closely tied to the kind of artisanal hipster delis that I'm looking at. They're part of what's called the new Jewish food movement. So these are folks who are absolutely in conversation with one another and are thinking about what it means to be an American Jew and to think about the values that they have as Americans now, and kind of they see themselves as reinvigorating American Jewish food practices. And I think that I'm not an expert on the Jewish farming movement. Adrian Krohn is actually working on an amazing book about it. Has written about their practices of Shemitah and is doing just amazing work. I'm really excited to continue to learn from her on this. But I think you're right in pointing to kind of the complex ways that folks are using the idea of tradition and what gets labeled traditional, that we could be labeling, that actually a lot of folks do label, jarred gefilte fish as traditional. that has been an American Jewish tradition, and the folks that you're pointing to are saying, okay, we're gonna look back to biblical models and label that, try to figure out how that can be a tradition in our lives. I think that what I'm particularly interested in is the emotional resonance of these things and the way that emotion guides people's actions or provides meaning to people's work in these ways.
Yeah, I'll just add one quick thing, and that is, I think that's important, and I don't want to say I'm hopeful, but I'm not so pessimistic as the whole narrative of the vanishing Jew, and particularly I'm starting to look at Jewish political activism around climate change and climate change politics, and particularly seeing how for young American Jews, it's part of their meaning making right now. So it's kind of interesting. But anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm so excited to learn what you find about Jews and climate change. That's really exciting work.
We have one more question from Melvin Barinholtz.
Yes, I enjoyed your talk. It was interesting, but I found it kind of strange that you did not distinguish between organizational fears of Jewish decline and the recognition that Orthodox Judaism is by no means and by no perspective in decline. Orthodox Judaism, which was supposedly going to disappear at the mid-century with predictions, on the contrary, is growing, and not growing in terms of nostalgia, but in terms of synagogue attendance, deep involvement with Jewish learning, spending time in Israel, supporting Israel, and it's not in decline at all. Now, you were talking, I think what you said applies to the rest of the community. I agree with Eric that it's not sustainable. I think it's nice that it's going on now. Since 2006 is a blink of history. I don't think in 20 years, if these hipsters delis continue to exist, they won't be Jewish. They'll be Jewish in name only. I just don't find it convincing that, as I say, I don't think it's sustainable. When 70% of non-Orthodox Jews are intermarrying, whether or not you think that's a problem, their children, to whatever extent they continue and will have nostalgia, it's going to diminish very rapidly through the generations.
So I appreciate that comment. Thank you. I actually have found the opposite, that folks who are in interfaith families are absolutely passing on this nostalgia. We've seen this actually for 4 generations now, right? If we're tracing this since the 1970s, okay, a certain kind of Holocaust memory and Holocaust and Israel activism is only that old. So those kinds of forms of Jewish community organization are actually not that, are in that same blink of an eye. But I think to your point about Orthodox Jews, which I really appreciate, and comparing these to synagogue attendance and traditional practices, I think that's so important. Thank you for raising that. What I actually, folks really want to read my work as being about Jewish, what's sometimes called Jewish nuns, the Jews of no religion. The folks that I'm studying are absolutely across the Jewish religious spectrum. If there is I don't love that term, but if there is a spectrum, the folks that I'm looking at who are engaging in these nostalgic practices are all kinds of Jews, including Orthodox Jews, including Orthodox rabbis. So what I'm looking at is, like Holocaust commemoration, like Israel support for Israel used to be, these are things that unite Jews actually across the spectrum. Not everybody participates in them, but they are found throughout the spectrum of American Jews. And also those, because we're looking at a wide range of Jews, we're looking at folks who, as with Holocaust commemoration and with support for Israel, these are practices that people do alongside and complementing any kind of other traditional religious practices. So I very deliberately called my book Beyond the Synagogue and not replacing the synagogue. That these are, you can go to, I think many of us know that you can go to a deli and go to a synagogue, right? But these are things that you can do them alongside. It's not a replacement of the synagogue, but a complement to it for many people. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Let me know if there are more questions, but I'm just gonna seize my my prerogative as the chair to ask one more now that you're here and I can pick your brain. So I know you're, of course, a scholar of American religion, but I am curious if you've seen some similar phenomena among European Jews that live in a less multi-religious society very often. And I wonder if recent developments in Israel have had any impact, or if you've considered possible comparisons among young, non-traditionally religious people in Israel that, however, of course, identify Jewishly in ways that we normally would call cultural, and young American Jews.
I love that question. Thank you. And I wonder if you or others are better posed than I am to answer it. I think we see some of it, certainly, like, nostalgia for Eastern European history absolutely happens in very particular ways in Europe and in Israel. I think that what I'm looking at in the United States since the 1970s is really the institutionalization of nostalgia, that there are particular institutions and organizations that have been built up around it. And you might find some of these in Europe and in Israel, but I think that institutionalization is maybe a particular feature of American Jews, and that I don't find it in exactly the same ways in Israel and the United States. Some of these are international phenomena in terms of like Jewish genealogists are of course an international organizations, but I think that it's interesting to me that they really the modern phenomenon of Jewish genealogy as we know it with the organizations and institutions that we have it really gets started in the United States in the 1970s and now has kind of spread throughout the world. And I think that generally all of these things are drawing on other broader American trends and making them Jewish in some way. The hipster delis, the museum preservation, not that these things don't happen elsewhere, but the ways they're happening in the United States seem pretty particular to me. But I'll be interested in anyone else who has more experience elsewhere.
Yeah. It just occurred to me that a lot of the work of Jewish nostalgia in Europe is done by non-Jews.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's a lot of it, but it's done by people that happen to chance on Judaism, and they're not converting, but they're just fascinated by the Jewish past in Europe.
And they do a lot of non-Jews do really important preservation work, and organizing Jewish records and that sort of thing, that has helped academic researchers around the world, as some of you may know even better than I do.
We have one more question from Jay Oppenheim.
Hi, thanks so much for the presentation and discussion. It's very rich and very thought-provoking. I'm curious what you think, or kind of, I feel like you've spoken to this, but I want to maybe put more of a point on it. The shift in conversation around these kind of practices often moves away from the practice and talks about them in terms of their sustainability. So focus on the future rather than on the present. And kind of what it ends up doing is it doesn't look at the people doing it, right? It looks at their potential for doing it in the future. And kind of the implication is that they're kind of less ethnic or less authentically ethnic. I've looked more at Russian-speaking Jews, and there's a similar kind of similar move kind of in discussions around them of not focusing on them and instead of focusing on their future and saying if their future is unsustainable, then we don't have to, essentially, it often feels like the message is we don't have to think about them that much. Right? And if we don't have to give too much consideration or concern, and I'm not entirely sure, but it feels like there's this sort of rhetorical or discursive move that's meaningful, that's playing out here. Delis aren't serious, or genealogy isn't serious, or whatever it is, right? Though making meaning and finding community are serious. And so I don't know if you've sort of how you've thought about this or how you speak to it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that articulation. I think that's exactly right. You know, folks who I've certainly gotten a lot of pushback from folks who don't like these trends, right? Who don't like that these things are happening. And it's funny to me that you know, my work as a scholar is not necessarily to say whether these are good or bad. I think my work is to say that you know, this is meaningful for many American Jews. Like, let's pay attention to it. Others can decide like what they want to do with it, but here I am documenting it and analyzing it. And part of what's been funny to me too, I'll say that I've gotten some very, very negative feedback from folks who read me into my work. And that's interesting to me. Partly, I think, like, just to name the obvious, that I'm a younger female scholar, and folks see this stuff as being about young Jews, even though I'm consistently saying, look, I'm looking at a broad age range and all types of Jews. And actually, this isn't my own practice. This isn't about me. And I you know, it actually was, I will say in this context, I do keep kosher, actually. And I was researching non-kosher delis, and to do that as an ethnographer is a fairly complicated work. And you know, I ethnographers, anthropologists are these days are so wonderful about thinking deeply about placing themselves in their work. And I think that's so important. I couldn't do that in quite the same way, actually, that I was very careful about what I revealed about myself, because if I told people who own non-kosher delis that I keep kosher, their responses to me would be really different. And I wouldn't, you know, they might put their guard up in a slightly different way. So I've been getting the kind of pushback that I think you're talking about, and I've been getting people reading it onto me in really uncomfortable ways, and that's been really interesting. It's interesting to me that people see this as kind of threatening, the work that I'm doing, or the people that I'm talking about, they might see us as threatening to their imagination of the Jewish future, and they see my work naming it as threatening, which is interesting to me. Thanks for that. Thanks very much for that comment.
Thank you. I would add that I think that sort of in relationship to kind of groups that are often kind of thought about in terms of the future and therefore dismissed in the present, that it's often elderly, sort of communities of older Jews are often also thought of sort of unsustainable. There's no future here, and therefore we don't have to think about this place. And so it's interesting to hear that a topic that's associated with younger Jews is dismissed, right? Which is often kind of the motif that you see about kind of aging communities.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right about older Jews. And, you know, I think the genealogy stuff that I'm looking at is absolutely seen as about older Jews and therefore not important. And so much of this conversation is about the Jewish continuity discourse, right? Which is like very literally about child, you know, people of childbearing age, right? And about their wombs and their potential progeny, right? And people are so concerned with how are they going to reproduce and what are their potential offspring going to look like, that they're ignoring, you know, what they and many other Jews are doing in the present, the way they are, and many other folks are finding meaning. And I think you're absolutely right to point us to older folks as well, that I'm really interested. I think in a future project, I'm really interested in the institutions that are so focused on younger folks and folks of childbearing age, that I think Jewish community funds are ignoring older folks. That you know, it's a question of where American Jews are spending their money and how they're spent. Like billions of dollars are at stake in these questions.
Are there any more questions from the audience? Oh, Omri?
Hi, yeah, I just have a brief question, which is, I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the relationship between nostalgia and pain. Because I think one of the reasons that people maybe are sometimes dismissive of what they perceive as recent cultural trends and nostalgia is that it always seems kind of laced in sort of parody and whimsy and the kind of positive retro sense of how we think about nostalgia. But nostalgia in past eras in history has often been associated with pain, a kind of painful longing for the past. And I was just wondering, to what extent did you address or experience those kinds of sentiments in terms of like thinking of the past as not just something that people have a desire to connect with, but also the ambiguity of that connection and the pain that can come along with seeking that emotional link with something that's actually very distant?
Yeah. Thank you for that articulation about pain. I love that. I don't think I thought about it exactly in those words, but I really appreciate that. I think about nostalgia as, it is sentimental, absolutely, but I think about it as a sentimental longing for an irrevocable past. And I think the pain comes in with the fact that it's irrevocable. This also always makes me laugh, especially when I teach this to students. I'm like, yeah, the past is irrevocably past. That's like literally how time works. And nostalgia is that emotional response to the fact that that's literally how time works, that we can only go forward. And I think I see this in American Jewish materials, thinking about Eastern European stuff. You get a lot of descriptions about how grimy and miserable, the Lower East Side was at the turn of the 20th century. There's a real glorification of poverty that is pretty troubling. And the narrative usually is that they worked hard, and it was it was painful, and it was unpleasant, but they had the warmth of family, is usually how the story goes. That something about that family structure, that community structure, has been lost. So I think it's a nostalgia is about a pleasure, taking pleasure in that pain to some extent. Yeah. Thank you for that articulation.
Any other questions? Stephen, you
I have
more?
another question comment. And I guess I think, Rachel, you said at one point that PJ Library you thought was one of the most important or influential in American Judaism. And I live in Western Mass, so I know PJ Library very well. Listeners here may not know, it's, and you correct me if I'm wrong, it's sponsored by the Grinspoon Foundation out here. And I'm part of a Chavara, which is supported by the Grinspoon Foundation. And it brings together couples. We're all empty nesters, and we're all coming together, meeting once a month and doing Shabbat and talking about how we're coping with our new empty nests. And some of us are, not my wife and myself, but others are interfaith, intermarried. So there's that dynamic as well. But I'm familiar with PJ Library, but I want, maybe if you could say a little bit more about its influence. And I also thought PJ Library is in Israel. Mm-hmm. So yeah. I find that interesting, and I'm wondering what the texts are, the children's books that are being sent to Israel, distributed in Israel. Are they same as here? And how does that nostalgia cross over?
Yeah, thanks for asking about PJ Library, one of my very favorite topics. So I wrote a book chapter. I address books that are part of that are distributed by PJ Library in my book. I've written a separate book chapter arguing that I think we should understand PJ Library as religious and as influential. And I will say that even though staff members are like, we do not call PJ Library religious, they have responded positively to my work. So that's interesting to me. I think PJ Library is just hugely important. I think we have the stats to show that it's hugely important. They are getting, I don't have kids, but the folks I've studied who are recipients of PJ Library tell me that PJ Library, it's PJ for pajama, right? That PJ Library gets you where you're most vulnerable as a parent of young kids. That bedtime is when you are most vulnerable, that you are exhausted and you just want the kid to go to bed. And like, look, PJ Library is handing you a book at your most vulnerable moment and telling you not just like, here's a book to read, but here's a way to have conversations with your kids. And then they do more. They don't just distribute books, but they have a whole, depending on where you are, this varies location to location, because it's sponsored by the Grinspoons Foundation, and half the my understanding is generally you sign up through a local organization, and half the money will come from the Grinspoon organization, and half will have to come from a local Jewish organization. So it has to be a partnership, is how it's designed. And the folks on the ground, there's often in many places, there's a staff person, you know, at your federation, at your local JCC, who is a PJ Library staff member, who will work with families. And their goal is to connect PJ Library recipients, especially interfaith families, especially folks they see as maybe not part of Jewish communal structures, and bring them in. PJ Library is supposed to be like a gateway drug to traditional Jewish, to the institutions that we recognize as Jewish communal ones. So if you get a PJ Library book about Purim, for instance, they're going to say, okay, here's some other families you might connect with. You might start a group to connect with other local families. Maybe you want to take your kid to the Purim Carnival. Maybe once you take your kid to the Purim Carnival, you're going to sign up for Hebrew school, right? Maybe once you sign up for Hebrew school, you're going to start lighting Shabbat candles, right? So it's absolutely seen as a gateway drug. And we have the statistics to show, and certainly a whole lot of anecdotal evidence to say that this is changing families. This is absolutely changing families. And another conversation is that it's changing the structure of children's book publishing in the United States. Your question about Israel is fantastic, and I don't have the answer to it. I haven't studied the way it works in Israel, but I suspect I suspect that there are different concerns motivating it. And if others have experience with that, I'd love to hear more about that. But I think it's different kinds of communal concerns that are guiding it outside of North America.
Yeah, thanks. Interesting stuff. And just as a recipient or someone who's in this community and the Grinspoons, it's all about continuity. It's all about community. It's all about promoting Jewishness in a very positive way. So thanks.
I think in Israel, I just wanted to say about the PJ, it is distributed through like the early childhood daycare system. So kindergartens, it's a bit different in Israel. So, but it's not like here that we are, need to subscribe and get it by mail, but they send it to the school, and then I think maybe then they distribute it maybe to kids, but I'm not sure. But it's through the school system, through the education system. So, and I think it connects to it's something slightly different in that sense, that in Israel now they talk about like bringing these religious sentiments through the school into people. And that's like a different struggle there between, religion and being Jewish, but not religion. So it's secular. So sorry. But thank you. It was really, really interesting. And I mean, just to say for me, so I'm an Israeli. I live here in New York, and I have kids that were born here, and so it's always like this. So again, in Israel, it's like you're Jewish. You don't have to do a lot to be. You are part of it. It's just part of the world. And here, I find it much more the struggle. It's much more. There are many more challenges when it comes to kids, and especially when you don't live in an area where there are many other Jews, or there isn't any Hebrew school, or it's more difficult to get to one. So I always find it. I find it challenging. So it was really interesting to see it from a different point of view.
Thank you so much for both of those comments. Appreciate it.
Any final questions before we close the call? So if there are no more questions, I want to thank Rachel Gross for a fantastic presentation and the beautiful conversation that followed. And I want to thank you all for your really thoughtful questions. And once again, if you'd like to receive information from the Center for Jewish Studies, I'm going to put the email that you can reach here, and also again use code GROSS30FM for 30% off and free shipping from NYU Press for Rachel Gross's book. Thank you again, and Shabbat Shalom, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.